Hi everybody, and welcome to our module on defense mechanisms. Shown on the screen is a picture of Sigmund Freud, and in the early 20th century he came up with what is now known as Freudian psychology. And according to Freudian psychology, there are three components to our psyche. The first is the id, which is our desires, and the second is the superego, which are the rules of society and our morality. And as you can imagine, the id and the superego are often in conflict. We may see some food and we want to eat it, but we know that the food does not belong to us and that we can't take it. Therefore, the id and the superego are in conflict. So the third component of the psyche is the ego, and its job is to mediate between the id and the superego. Its job is to come up with a plan so we can get the food while still obeying the rules of society. And so if you understand that, then it should be fairly straightforward to understand ego defenses. Ego defenses are unconscious adjustments in reality perception, and I've bolded the word unconscious because that's very important here. When a person employs an ego defense, they don't consciously decide to do it in order to resolve a conflict in their mind. It's an unconscious phenomena, and the goal of the ego defense is to resolve and manage conflict between the id and the superego. By employing these defenses, we minimize anxiety and we adapt to stressful circumstances. So for the rest of this video, we'll go through a number of ego defenses one at a time. There are lots and lots of these. I've picked some of the most important to highlight in this video. The first one is acting out, and this is a way of avoiding emotions by bad behavior. If we have an emotion that is stressful and hard for us to deal with, we will engage in bad behaviors such as attention seeking or socially inappropriate behavior. So some examples are a child who has sick parents that begins to misbehave at school. The child's id wants the parents to be healthy, but the superego knows that that's not possible. In order to reconcile that conflict, the child begins to misbehave. Another example is an adolescent who engages in promiscuous sex during the parents' divorce. The adolescent doesn't want the parents to get divorced, but knows that they can't control that and can't change that, so they engage in promiscuous sex as an adaptive behavior. Denial is a defense mechanism whereby we refuse to accept an unpleasant reality. So examples of this in medicine could be a patient who thinks his doctor is wrong about a diagnosis of cancer or heart disease. Another example is a heavy drinker who believes she only drinks socially and doesn't really have a problem. Projection is the attribution of our own feelings or emotions onto others. For example, a person who cheats on an exam may accuse a classmate of cheating off of him. The cheater can't accept the reality that they have broken the rules of society and they feel guilty, and in order to make themselves feel better, they accuse someone else of the same thing that they have done. Regression is reversion to behavior of a younger person or child when faced with a stressful situation. So for example, a stressed adult might begin to watch cartoons from his or her childhood when faced with a stressful situation. This could be evidence of regression. Another example is a sick adult who doesn't want their parents to leave the hospital, wants the parents to stay in the hospital with them, just like the parents were always with them as a child. A final example that is somewhat common is when a hospitalized older child begins to wet his or her bed, even though they had stopped doing that many years ago. That child is regressing to past behavior. Displacement is the direction of emotions onto another person. This often occurs when people are angry. So for example, if a patient is angry about an injury but decides to express that anger at the doctor, they are displacing their anger over the injury onto the doctor. Another example could be a mother who's angry at her husband but doesn't feel comfortable yelling at her husband, so instead she decides to yell at her child. This is displacement. Reaction formation refers to turning feelings into opposites. This goes beyond denial. The person doesn't just deny the feelings, but they actually claim that the opposite is true. So for example, a man who craves alcohol will preach that abstinence is the best way to lead your life. Another example could be a woman who despises her mother but then throws a birthday party for her mother. A final example could be a parent who despises their child because of the child's behavior but shows extreme love and affection to the child. It's more than just denial, it's going in the opposite direction. Intellectualization is avoiding emotions through reasoning. So an example of this could be someone who is going through a divorce, talks to a friend and cites divorce statistics instead of admitting sadness. They are turning the divorce from an emotional event into something that is an intellectual experience, and they are talking about it without feeling the emotions of what's going on. Rationalization is somewhat similar to intellectualization. In patients who rationalize, they distort events so the outcome is positive. So for example, someone who gets fired from their job, instead of feeling the sadness and the emotions of being fired, they will say, "I'm glad I got fired, I needed a change." They are rationalizing that event so that it's a positive thing. Repression is sometimes called motivated forgetting. It refers to forgetting one particular memory or fact that is very uncomfortable to the person. It's often something that happened long ago. For example, a very difficult period in childhood. The person is unable to remember that because they have repressed the memory. This was the first defense mechanism described by Freud, so it's famous for that reason. And the way Freud explained this defense mechanism was that the thoughts were being repressed in order to avoid guilt. Isolation of affect refers to isolating a distressing memory or event in our minds by failing to experience the emotions of the event. So an example of this is a person who describes a rape without expressing any sadness. That person has taken the emotions out of the event so that they can talk about it in a very flat way, and that way they don't have to face the reality of what happened. Splitting refers to categorizing others at extremes. It's sometimes called all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking. And patients who engage in splitting will often describe others as either wonderful or horrible, but nothing in between. So for example, a patient who splits might love her doctor but hate her nurse. They can't accept that others have some qualities that are good and some qualities that are bad, so they describe people at extremes. And this is very common in borderline personality disorder patients, which I talk about in another video. Undoing is very similar to reaction formation. It's a reaction to unhealthy or destructive thoughts or acts. In patients who are undoing, they engage in contrary behavior, trying to make things unhappen. So for example, a patient who thinks about hurting someone will act overly nice in response to try and undo those thoughts about hurting the other person. Altruism refers to the practice of showing concerns for others. In other words, caring for others to help reduce your own stress or anxiety. So an example of altruism as a defense mechanism would be a cancer survivor who helps others with the same disease. Humor is a defense mechanism that relieves anxiety by using jokes and laughter. So an example you may know very well is a med student who jokes about board studying. The med student is trying to manage the feelings of stress and anxiety about the boards by making jokes. Sublimation refers to using negative emotions in a positive way. So for example, a person who is anxious might choose to become a security guard because their anxiety will keep them on alert and make them a better security guard. Another example is an aggressive person who chooses to become a boxer. This gives them an outlet for their aggression. Suppression is a unique defense mechanism because it is conscious. Patients consciously choose to engage in suppression in order to help them cope. Usually patients do this intentionally to relieve stress or anxiety. What they often do is ignore stressful thoughts or feelings or topics in order to help them better cope. So for example, a patient using suppression as a defense mechanism may say, "I'm not going to think about that now." When asked about an uncomfortable or stressful topic, that is suppression. And it's important to understand that suppression is different from repression, which we talked about earlier. Repression is an unconscious defense mechanism by which patients forget certain memories that are stressful or upsetting. In suppression, the patient is consciously choosing to ignore things in order to help them cope. I'll finish with this slide and mention the mature defense mechanisms. Mature defense mechanisms are considered mature ways of dealing with our conflicts. So, for example, acting out is not a mature defense because engaging in bad behavior to avoid confronting an emotion is not considered a mature act. But the four defenses shown on this slide are considered mature defenses: sublimation, altruism, suppression, and humor. These defenses generally result in positive things and do not result in harm to others, and therefore they're considered mature. And because they are mature, these defenses are sometimes entered into by patients consciously. As I told you in the beginning of this video, defense mechanisms as originally described by Freud were considered unconscious, and most of them are. But the four shown on this slide are sometimes entered into consciously by people who want to resolve conflicts within their mind. And that concludes our module on defense mechanisms.